choose the topic, and if any question come up from Klaus, because we have a guy, Klaus Deisner. Can you say your name? Joining us from outside of
yeah, Klaus is from SAP, so he's okay. He's in Europe. Yep.
Yeah.
Can I suggest that it would also be good to review the pending PRs and then also some of the issues to make sure that we keep merging the PRs and then we keep closing the issues.
Yeah. Planning to do when I talk to Andres before the call, because I didn't know special topic today, so we just go across the request and work on that.
Before we get into that, Juno, can you share the meeting notes in the chat?
Sure. I think they don't share on
I'm happy.
Slack OFS channel, but I will send you. Or I will send in the message.
I didn't see them there. Also, just FYI, it seems like this call is... I don't know if there's a way to tell Meet to allow anyone to join the call, because it asks if anyone without a Bitnami email address can join.
I think it's free and open for everyone. It's not required Bitnami email address to join the call.
So when Klaus joined earlier, it said this person is from outside of Bitnami. Click admin.
Yeah, this one.
No, so Tuna, I don't think you understood what Adnan says. So, is there a way to make this meeting like totally open so that there is no difference if somebody joins from, not Bitnami?
Yeah, I know.
Like, let me join from a different persona. We'll see what.
Then I have to click add admit. Let me just figure out how to configure it on Google Meet.
Yeah, if we can't configure it on Google Meet, yeah, so it says someone outside of Bitnami wants to join this meeting.
Correct. I have to.
If we can't, yeah, just said it popped up with something saying that I need to click admit to allow you in. If we can't do this with Meet, then I'm just using something else, like Zoom or something.
Yeah, otherwise we can go with Zoom, but I'm not too sure if there is any limitation for the number of attendees.
So I could check if we can give Kubeless the SIG-Apps account for these calls. I'll check with Matt and Michelle if they're okay with that.
Yeah, Zoom has a 40-minute limit if using the free version.
Yeah, the SIG-Apps is a pro account, so we can get around that if we can use it.
Okay, can we make a note of that to make the meeting non Bitnami video conferencing dependent?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we're gonna get it started by just go through the open pull requests. So let's go from the top to bottom. So the first one is the handle raise condition by updating component, opened by Andres. So
if you can share the screen, it's gonna be better. Just to.
Okay, I can share my screen.
Yeah.
Sure. So, Andres, can you talk about your?
Yes, this is supposed to be a quick pull request. It's just a comment that Gus made in a previous pull request that it is basically I modified the update approach, and instead of using patch, it's using the update verb. But if you use the update verb, it could occur a race condition in which if two updates happens at the same time, one of the updates can be lost. So yeah, this is just handling that. As you can see, instead of just updating with the new object, I'm retrieving the previous one and update the fields that we are interested in. Yes.
Yeah, so I looked at it briefly, and my comment is because I saw the owner's reference, object map owner reference, and I saw equals or, and I was like, what? And or object owner's reference, which is passed as an argument to the function. So I was like, okay, that's a bit strange, but
Yeah.
technically nothing wrong with it.
But had the traffic will fail.
Probably it's just unstable. I didn't check. I need to check it, but probably an unstable bit.
Okay, so I guess we can move to the next one. I think when the traffic will turn to green, then we can or give it more days. The second one is work in progress. Update sometime is function port forecast and port by Shaw.
Yeah.
We don't have him here. The next one is the file go to v4.0. I review it. I see no problem with it. So I'm okay. Because I need the rebasing.
Yeah, I saw the cast review from this morning. Yeah, I need to check that comment because apparently that variable is global and I didn't know that. So.
All right.
I have a question. When we update the client version, I'm still confused. How are API versions group changes being handled? Like when we jump from 1.7 to 1.8, and if an API graduates to stable, how is the client handling this and handling the backward compatibility?
As far as I know, the client is at the end doing a request to the Kubernetes API, so it's reaching the endpoint that is configured in the client. So if you go and use client core v1 is using the API of core v1. And if the endpoint changes and the URL is different, it's on the cluster side. The management of that is done in the cluster side. That's why, for example, the cron job definition works in Minikube for Kubernetes 1.8, but it doesn't work in GKE. Because the endpoint is using the old one, and in the case of Minikube, it is redirecting the request to the proper endpoint, but that doesn't work in GKE, for example. That is what I saw.
Yeah, so that's a problem because we're gonna keep breaking. I mean, when API job objects change version, we're gonna break things.
Yes. As we currently just support Kubernetes 1.7 and 1.8, we just need to check those two scenarios. But yes, we need to check every time we update this. We need to change both versions and check that everything goes well.
Morali, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so there's no way out, right? I mean,
Yeah, this is a bit silly. So if you use an old client, it will continue to produce the same on-the-wire format always, right? It'll produce the same REST payload that it always did before. When the server side, or when the other side goes to a newer version, so there's a whole bunch of different things. There's what actually goes on the wire, and that very rarely changes. There's what the Go code sees when it uses the client, and if you go to a newer version, often they add more fields. So when you look at the struct, you'll see new fields in there, and they'll have new default values and things. And yet it's still compatible when it goes onto the wire, because those other fields will get ignored by an older server. On the server side, there's a bunch of extra magic to try to merge versions and try to convert from one version to another version. A lot of those features don't apply to us because they don't work for CODs or TPRs, all that eternal version migration stuff. So in a lot of ways, we don't need the newer versions until we need access to a newer type. So if we want to use a beta 2, whatever they are, deployment or something, then we have to go to a version of the client that has that in it. And then the general compatibility rules for Kubernetes are only sort of 2 versions. So it's possible for a 1.9 Kubernetes server to no longer support 1.7 objects. Even though that would be a bit rude for something. Actually, no, it depends on whether it's alpha or beta version APIs. So then we need to adapt. So if we want to use a newer version, we have to modify not just the client Go, but then also our code that is using those client Go objects. We've got to use a newer object. And that we have to keep up with whatever the servers of the day are using. But that, as I said, really only kicks in for alpha and beta objects, because the fully stable objects are stable pretty much.
Yeah, but so we also have to be aware of what's the oldest version that Kubeless will run on, right? Server side.
Yeah, well, what do we test against? Not that our test exercises everything, but...
It's on Minikube, so it's the latest version of Minikube.
It's 1.0, 1.8.0.
Well, that we should probably fix then.
Does the documentation state what specific version we support of Kubernetes?
Nope.
Or is it just the N?
Nope.
The current version, I guess, or current Minikube version, I guess.
So we should have a matrix that shows that clearly. Otherwise, it's going to be confusing. I'm worried that when we update a client like this, then we break. Like if somebody is still on 1.6 and they try it, and it's gonna bomb, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. That's a reasonable concern. For comparison with sealed secrets, I test across multiple versions of Kubernetes using Minikube. So I test across 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 Kubernetes clusters.
Are you using the same Travis CI setup than Juanjo setup?
An improved version of it, yes.
Okay, so maybe we can. Yeah, okay, so we should do that.
It's straightforward. It just means you have to wait longer.
But I also have a question regarding to the client version here, because we know that we have a problem with for example, the cron job issue. When in 1.8 it use the beta API version, but the 1.7 is the alpha. So should we support both of that in the term of we clarify the Kubernetes version and you can separate the K for both of that, for both of that K, do you think we should do that?
There's not much. So most of the time, Kubernetes has this pattern of they put things in alpha and then put it in annotations, and then they'll graduate to beta, which is basically the same thing, and then they'll go to the final, except they never go to the final version, which takes it out of the annotation and puts it into an object attribute. Most of the time, there's some compatibility code on the server side that will translate the older forms into the newer form inside the Kubernetes server. So unless you actually need some new functionality or new behavior that's only exposed in those newer versions, I would suggest sticking to the oldest version that meets with our Kubeless compatibility statements. Because there's no reason for us to do compatibility on the client side if it's only going to match exactly what the server would do anyway when translating between versions on the server side.
Okay.
Okay, so we need more eyes on this PR, and we need more LGTM, more Ali. I don't know if you had a chance to do this, and then I just added a note that we need to modify the Travis run so that we test on multiple versions.
Yeah, I'll take a look and I'll probably test it out as well.
Okay, 4:15. Morali, go for it. That's yours.
Yeah, so yeah, basically right now the default trigger is the PubSub one. Just a small change to make it HTTP as a default trigger. So I updated the patch reflecting the changes requested by Andrew.
Yeah, that's fine. I was going to comment that it's a little bit weird because trigger HTTP in the code is defaulting to false. It's a boolean that is default to false. But then we are using the default function spec in a little bit up to now. So that's it. Default function, we are using the default function spec in order to set it to HTTP when the trigger HTTP is defaulting to false. Anyway, it's just a small change, but it's okay. Yeah, that's fine. You can merge this if you want. I'm going to approve it after this code.
Okay.
So are you guys happy? Andres, Morali, you guys are happy like this?
Yeah, it makes sense to make it HTTP default.
That's no problem from my side.
But the point is that you're happy that you're happy together about the actual implementation and the reviews and the feedback on the reviews.
Yeah.
So
I think Andrew didn't get a chance to look the updated patch. Maybe, like he said, he'll take a look and approve it. He's happy with that.
okay.
Okay. The next one is from I submitted. So what I'm seeing is that when we do a Kubeless auto scale list or Kubeless ingress list, or we list the whole every auto API object or ingress object, including created by Kubeless or not created by Kubeless. So I add. So the solution, I add the label for every object created by Kubeless for filtering, for listing. It had error in the integration test. I think I will fix this, but it's just general ideas all about it. I don't know if you guys have any other opinion on this pull request.
For me, that's fine. Once you fix the issues with the bed and so on.
Yeah,
that's fine.
The next one is very small on the README.
Hang on, we mentioned last time we talked about this change. We mentioned whether we care about the fact that we might run more than one Kubeless controller, and that maybe we should be adding a class, like a unique name here that defaults to Kubeless, but isn't always the fixed string Kubeless, because that way if you have two controllers, they're still going to fight over the same objects.
Yes. So yeah, that makes sense. I will keep updating the pull request, or maybe you can add a follow-up for request.
Make it a global flag or something on the Kubeless controller, and it defaults to the Kubeless string, and then it's just whatever that identifier is what it puts and looks like.
Okay. The next one is a small thing on README, the community session listing the links to accept the meeting and everything else. So nothing. The next one is from Sean as service spec to function spec, still working in progress. I guess we want to.
So Sean is from TripAdvisor. They're evaluating Kubeless, and he's also their security officer or in charge of a big portion of the security of the infrastructure. So he's really hardening the Kubernetes cluster. That's why he also asked to add security context to the functions and things like this. Okay, which we don't have right now. So right. Just as a little bit of context.
Well, we can do security context to the functions. That's already works.
We can add it to the function spec, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's not by default.
Correct. Yes, I guess there's no reason why not.
So yeah, in the case
so
of...
we could.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so we could add, a little bit tighter security context on the pods, right? The deployment.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say that this pull request is just because he needed to set the services at headless, and also he wanted to specify the port when running a function, the port of the service. So he finally split this in two. This one is for the, I guess it's gonna be for the headless service, and the first one we saw is for the port. So once if we have two different pull requests, it's gonna be easier to review.
So there is a different bug issue open for the security context. I think I'll pick it up. It's 393.
Right, there's an issue for it, I think.
So,
okay, the next one is the proposal, decoupling trigger proposal. Can you share the update on the rest?
Yeah, I can talk a lot about this, but basically we have more or less an agreement in which we know how to decoupling them. The only thing remaining is the architecture, because depending on the architecture that we choose, it's gonna be different how we handle security, how we handle networking. So Sean is pretty active with this, and he has a strong point saying that if we split this in different pods, the latency for a normal HTTP request is gonna be increased unnecessarily. So that's true, and I'm going to investigate. I think it's something feasible to just deploy everything in the same pod. Is something similar to what Nucleo does, but Nucleo is using just one container. It's not splitting diamonds between different containers. That brings some problems. Like if a diamond dies, the process dies with it and is not being recovered. So you cannot restarted it. At least they don't support it for the moment. So I think it's going to be easier for us and more natural to use different containers. I'm going to investigate it and check if we can get rid of that latency overhead. That's something doable. I need to spend a little bit more time on this, and once I have that, hopefully everything is gonna be happy with the solution, and we can go ahead and start implementing it.
Right, and I think that's why they did the build step also. It's because they can configure the runtime depending on the trigger and the language. So they have like build requirements, and then they have runtime requirements that they can get through to config map.
I didn't spend so much time in the build process, but yes, they have this build process that depends on a Docker registry, and they build an image, and then they use that image as the runtime image in two different steps. That's something that we have already evaluated. It's not something really. There is not a very good answer for that, because having a registry locally is kind of a pain. So yeah, they took that decision.
I still think the local registry is a good way to do it, and really the only useful way to do it when you have compiled languages, if you support compiled languages.
Yeah, it's the only way to do it. Yeah, unless you build the image on your own. But
and they use Linux socket to pass the payload to the process.
Yeah, they have a daemon running the typical. In the case of Python function, they have a Python daemon running locally, and the processor, that is the process that listens for connections from the outside, by proxy the request from the outside to this local daemon in the native language using this socket. Did I explain myself? No, no.
My gut reaction just like this is that yes, of course it works. It actually looks a little bit like OpenFaz that has this watchdog process, and then they build an image that has the watchdog that pipes everything to the actual function. But then it's kind of it's highly coupled, right? So I don't find it. Yeah, I don't find it super flexible.
It's not flexible in regards that for each native runtime you need to take into account a lot of things, and you need to. But at least it's decoupled in the sense that they have an interface. The interface is always maintained regardless of the event source and the runtime language. That's fine. But I think it's interface a little bit too complex, and if you take a look to the Python file, to the Python wrapper that they have, is a lot of code there.
It's what?
There is a lot of code in the Python wrapper, because they need to handle the sockets, the logger, a lot of things, and I think that's the reason why they don't support more languages, and because it's complex to implement all these infrastructure to add new runtimes. If we can avoid that, it's going to be an advantage.
I mean, technically a pod can do this, so I'm not sure what. I mean, there might be some performance hit if you have data going between two containers, but they're on the same. We can probably share the namespaces, the IPC namespace, and so on of those two containers in the same pod. and then it's almost the same as having two processes in the same container.
Yeah, that's right. As
Except
far as
Kubernetes doesn't share IPC namespaces yet.
yeah, as far as they are.
Oh, they don't?
As I pointed out, when we had this discussion briefly in Slack earlier today, or whatever, yesterday for you, whatever day. Nuclear also has this data sources thing, which is like triggers, but as a data source, which is an interesting approach. I can imagine. So they have a shared memory method to pass data from there, and I can imagine how that would be useful in the data sources end of things, where you might have a large amount of data already existing and already there, so you don't have to wait for HTTP requests or pub sub messages to arrive. You've already got the data there, so you can do something like shared memory map in, half a gig all at once, and then run your function across that very quickly, because now it's all sort of shared memory loaded across that data. So you're basically building like a MapReduce type thing. That I can understand why they bother doing all of this. For normal web requests or normal HTTP requests, a shared memory transport is going to be slower than just copying. Typically, the trade-off there is about 100 megabytes you've got to be before the cost of copying becomes larger than the cost of flushing the TLB from changing the memory mappings every time you try to map in some shared memory. So, yeah, like, really, I challenge them to come up with some benchmarks that says that all that complexity is worthwhile. Got to get a pretty strange use case, I think, before that becomes useful.
So how do we move forward? How do we break this up? I would be in favor of breaking this up in like small things. To me, there is one simple issue, which is the event context kind of like interface to the function that we could implement, right now. Then there is the build process, and then there is actual breakup of triggers.
Yeah, I think that the build process is nothing that we should handle here. It's a totally different topic. But first, we need to, once we have an interface between the trigger and the runtime, that's gonna be the first step. Then we can implement it and just do it in the same container, the same as we do now. Just moving for example, the Python version that we have for the Kafka trigger. Just move it to a neutral language, let's say Go, and do the proxy in the same container. We still will have one container for HTTP trigger and a different one for the Kafka trigger or the PubSub trigger. And we just at that point it's gonna be easier to just split it in whichever architecture we choose. If we choose different containers, that's fine. If we choose different pods, it's fine. But we have just the pieces, and it's a matter of moving them around.
Okay, so I'm still catching up with a lot of things, so some of it may not make sense, but let me say what I think. To me, it looks like we need to figure out the actors involved in whole pipeline. For instance, we have to think how apps are going to hook into the triggers, and second is how trigger to runtime, and as a function developer, what is the interface I have to stick to develop my function. So there are multiple facets of the problem. So we have to take a end-to-end view of things and probably break down. Instead of going bottom-up approach where we are thinking about runtime we do have to think about that, but if I see from end to end, I don't care about the internals. I don't want to know about the Kubeless internals. I just care I'm a data stream source. I just want to trigger the function. That's all I care. And the other actor or entity would be I'm a function writer. I don't want to know all the details. I just want to give me the interface and I just stick to it and do it. So to me, there are multiple facets of the problem, which gonna define the whole the projects itself. The one thing that I have noticed, I got some time to look around the OpenFAS and the Nucleo. So it's whatever approach that we take is the barrier to implement is not really that hard. I mean, we can pick up what Nucleo has done, and we can do what OpenFAS has done. It's really there's not big effort to implement different ways of it, but rather from the top-down approach or the external view of things. To me, it's though architecturally we need to have a sound ground for that, but the external entities like the data stream author or the function author, we have to make it extremely simple for them. Or maybe even the runtime, someone wants to use Kubeless and want to develop the runtime. For people like them, we have to make it things very simple and very intuitive. That's what is going to define the project. That's my view of whatever I got from the time I spent.
Agreed. Yes, we should look at this from the user's point of view, rather than just copying it, technology, hoping it works out in some cohesive whole. I think, like, I'm surprised we're still talking about the trigger separation. Like, we're basically going in circles around the exact same architecture that we talked about, I don't know, 6 months ago. Like, there's lots of micro decisions, but the big high-level decisions, there's no alternatives.
Yeah. Agree. We just need to start implementing the true interface, the one that is from the runtime to the function, and the other one that is from the runtime to the trigger source. Once we have those two interface, we implement them, and that's the big issue. Once we have it, it's just a matter of choosing an architecture, and that is supposed to be the easy part.
Right. So then we have a long list of micro decisions, like do we use HTTP or gRPC? Do we describe the triggers in line with functions or as separate API objects? Do we pack multiple, say, HTTP triggers into one pod, or do we have one per trigger? Like, there's lots and lots and lots of little micro decisions here, which are all individually sort of controversial, but at the same time, they don't really change the architecture at all.
So from a user standpoint, from the beginning, the idea has been to basically have a clone of AWS Lambda. And potentially Google Cloud Functions, but of course, the APIs are not the same and so on. So we could actually focus on AWS Lambda. Okay. And then, and just look at, what's the event format, what's the context format, and just adopt that. From the user interaction with the CLI, that's where you have here is my function, or here is my zip file which contains everything. That's what the user does. The users of Lambda, they don't do a Docker build like OpenFAS does, or like the FN project from Oracle does. There is no Docker build, and there is no concept of like a template which gives you a Docker file, and then you push your image yourself. So personally, I really would like to abstract all of that. Like, a user of Kubeless shouldn't know that there is a container behind it, or that there are containers behind it.
AWS also doesn't support lots of languages, right? So do they actually support compiled languages and things in Lambda? No, I'm sorry, let me rephrase. This becomes really easy. It becomes a very different sort of problem, a very different way you would describe this to a user if we had decided we're only going to support JavaScript, for example.
Yeah.
If we just said we only support JavaScript, you would build quite a different service with quite a different set of ways to describe it and ways to configure it, because you would know what your runtime behaved like. You would know that it, always behaved in a certain way. The user only ever provided code a certain way. You certainly wouldn't have to build a build pipeline. You wouldn't consider doing a build pipeline for it, for example. So, and if you were a service provider who only cared about a particular web serving, for example, use case, that would be quite reasonable. It's quite reasonable to say, if you want to use our service, you have to write in JavaScript. If, on the other hand, we want to be flexible and support everything that might possibly arrive, then we have to build an architecture that can support, building Erlang on the fly, and these other sorts of esoteric cases, and that then steers a bunch of other design considerations. So
everything. I don't think it's everything, but it's more than JavaScript.
right, so these are compiled languages. Let's get that out of the way.
Yeah, and definitely the big request has been Java and Go.
Right, so then they're compiled languages. So we certainly don't want to compile Java or Go kind of on the fly. Like that's quite expensive to do. Well, whatever, we could, but it's expensive to do. And then if you've got Java people who really just want to provide a zip of a huge amount of Java code, because that's how Java people work, then that also drives other decisions, because you're not going to put that inline into an API object. You're going to want to give a pointer to something out of band where that gets downloaded or somehow side-loaded.
Yeah, so AWS right now is Node, Python, Java, and C#.
Right. A small and slightly odd collection of languages.
Yeah, C# is interesting. So how do we move forward?
I mean that's also again about the build process, and we may end up with a different solution. But in this case, I will start implementing the interfaces again. Once we agree in the interfaces for the function, we can do a pretty similar interface that Lambda has, because it's more or less the standard. Once we have that, we can start with the other interface and keep moving. I don't know. I mean, if you want, I can do another pull request just to specify one interface. But it's gonna be not useless, but not complete until we have the full schema.
So why don't you start with a pull request? Yes, for that interface.
That's fine.
Actual code, then to get out of the discussion phase.
That's fine, yeah. But that's one of the biggest pieces. Because you need to implement that in all the languages that we have.
Yeah.
Need to
I think Klaus wants to say something.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure. I'm still struggling with my headset. So this is probably the pull request I have been watching most, but unfortunately not so much over the past 2 days. So I have to catch up a bit. I'm sure I will have some opinion after I caught up. So I was a bit surprised to see all this discussion again, because the initial proposal with the extra pod was fine to me. So probably I will write something in this over the next few hours or so.
Okay, that's fine. I think that's even that's a decision that we can postpone. I mean, we don't need that decision to start working on this.
Okay, I mean, I think you can get started. I just over this last thing here with this daemon and orchestrator and so on. I also have some gut feeling that this might be too complex.
Yeah, it has the reason. The main reason for investigating that is the latency, and maybe because Sean has the request that the the HTTP request has a latency of I think it was 40 milliseconds and so on. If we include a different pod, that would going to double that latency and maybe end up with.
Why? Is there so much latency inside a cluster? I'm a bit surprised to hear that.
Actually, I mean, he was also concerned about the various service, like the setting up ingress to the node port. There's multiple hops which currently the packet goes through. What he's doing right now is to avoid whole services, Kubernetes provisioning services, and directly hook up his DNS into the pod IP, so that the event trigger and function directly. There's no extra hops and the very little latency. Directly, he's calling up the pod IPs.
Okay.
He's quoting numbers.
Okay, so I will.
Yeah, he's quoting numbers just to pull out a thread here. You have 30 or 40 microseconds for packets between bare metal servers. That's by the time you go through all the layers of IP tables and bridging and stuff between pods across the coast. Right, and
Okay.
I mean, seriously, 30 microseconds, and he's thinking of using a serverless framework rather than writing some actual code? Like, I don't understand the use case he's trying to go for here.
Micro or milli?
Micro.
Oh,
Okay.
micro.
I understood milliseconds
This is what
in the
I'm saying.
beginning.
I understand millisecond.
What are we going for here? What's the use case that he's got that he cares about that level of like taking an extra network hop, and yet is simultaneously considering using like a lazy serverless framework rather than writing some actual native Go code or whatever, C++ code? Like, I'm confused.
I think he has a valid point. If you take probably Nginx does a little bit better job, but if you take HA proxy, and I mean, he doesn't care. He's a bare metal deployment. He's not running in public cloud where you want to expose stuff on the internet. And if you take public cloud kind of scenario, you have ingress. If you take HA proxy, you touch HA proxy, then node port, then pod. There's just too many hops, which whole defeats the purpose of the whole serverless itself. So for his perspective, running bare metal, he just doesn't see value of it. But it's one-off case. It's not a general setup where everyone wants that way. He probably has the skills to set up and do that way. But I would imagine the regular user would need to Kubeless to orchestrate and provision this.
What's his sort of big picture use case here? Like, is he talking millions of queries per second against some like high volume, low latency?
Right. Yeah, somewhere in the chart he mentioned probably thousands of pods or something like that. I don't know. The scale he's looking that I don't know, but just from argument's sake, I do see his point that it is all extra ops doesn't make sense. That's why his pull request for the headless service.
We have thousands of pods and hundreds of services, and he's planning to move them all to serverless?
Looks like, and he wants to use headless service. So my general opinion is...
It makes no sense. You can't return a DNS record with 1,000 entries.
If pod goes, he has the problem.
So to unblock this, I think that Andres, you should move forward with starting an implementation of the function interface.
That's fine.
And then Klaus, you're going to comment on the PR.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And then Sean is actually going to be at KubeCon. So Gus, we can talk to him at KubeCon and understand better the use case.
I think the Kubeless community, should also have a use case in mind. And it perhaps shouldn't be necessarily driven by someone who comes along and happens to have one. Like, we should actually decide what it is we're aiming for and architect around that.
Yeah.
We either match or don't match people who come along with their own use case.
So I think we are discussing two different things. I agree with Gus. So there's no way we can have one fit solution from Kubeless how to do the networking part. each person's requirements are different. I think that has nothing to do with this proposal. The Andrew is working. That's a totally orthogonal topic to discuss, how Kubeless has to expose the serverless functions. But that shouldn't have any.
It drives a lot of the decisions about trigger separation. For example, if you cared about high throughput, lots of small requests, if you cared about that, you certainly wouldn't be considering HTTP. You would definitely be using something like gRPC that didn't have header file blocking.
Yeah.
You would be worrying about putting the triggers on the same host as the, you look at sidecar containers sort of more seriously. You look at batching. You do lots and lots of batching of requests, so you were doing lots of requests.
Yeah, I agree. I mean,
right. There's lots of decisions you would do if that's what we're actually aiming for. I'm going to go out on a limb and say we're not aiming for that. And if there's something looking for that from Kubeless, they're going to be disappointed. Like we're not set up as a group to build that level of infrastructure. We can't test it. We can't benchmark it. We're just not going to build that level of infrastructure with our current approach or resources.
Okay, cool. So we have more reviews on the current PRs. We should try to close a lot of those PRs. There needs to be a cleanup on the issues because I think some of them are already closed. And then Andres, you're gonna move forward with that implementation?
Yeah.
And Morali, his name is Andres, not Andrew.
That's fine, you can call me Andrew.
Okay. Sorry about that, Andres.
Well, Angus is actually Gus, but yeah. Andres. Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. I mean, I have to drop off.
I think we also run out of time. Actually, 30 minutes is never been enough. I think there are two more pull requests, but it's been there for a long time. We don't think we should talk about it today. Any question?
Bash runtime one's still going on. I added another sort of follow-up to that today. It's just a matter of teaching the guy how to write shellcode, basically, at this point. And it's, I don't know, he keeps wanting to, whatever. I'll eventually steer him around to the answer I gave him early on in the pull in the review. We're not there yet.
All right. Okay. Is there any other question from your side, or we end the call this week? Okay. So thank you everyone for attending the call. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.